district in Caltrans for District 4. So as you can imagine, first they were involved with responding to the Ridgecrest earthquakes over the summer, which then morphed its way into trying to deal with the public safety power shutdowns. And lest you think, well, what in the world does that have to do with Caltrans? Things like, for example, to keep the Caldecott Tunnel open, they had to find somebody with gigantic fans that could run off generators. So, you know, it's things that I would not have thought about that have been tying up his time. And he was all set to come. We had a great conversation on Tuesday, and then Wednesday morning he was notified that the governor had decided to come to the Bay Area for the Loma Prieta anniversary. And so from Wednesday until 3 o'clock Thursday morning, he was organizing routes and security with the CHP. So he was going to try to come today, but clearly he was overwhelmed by the events. So that's the problem when you ask somebody who's an active emergency manager and involved in security. Life happens. So I hope we'll get a chance to hear from James another time. But I'd now like to introduce Professor Stephen Bukasic from San Jose State University's College of Engineering, our host department for the day. And thank you very much for the use of the lovely facility. And Stephen's going to lead our panel, a look back and a look forward, lessons applied 30 years after Loma Prieta. So, Stephen?
Thank you, Franny. So before we get to our main presentations, Franny wanted me to share some of my experience as a structural engineer for 35 years. I started in 1984, so before the Loma Prieta earthquake. And so I put together some slides from some pictures that I had from Loma Prieta, and to share some of my experience maybe a little bit before and some of that afterward. So hopefully I do this correctly. Okay, so the first picture here is, I believe this is downtown Watsonville. So this is kind of a classic parapet failure of an unreinforced masonry building, the parapet wall separating from the roof structure there, and then raining these bricks down onto the sidewalk. And very, very dangerous situation, and very common in these main streets in a lot of places all over the U.S. and predominantly and also in California. And so when I first started my structural engineering career in 1984, the office that I worked for was primarily doing a lot of retrofit of unreinforced masonry buildings, and a lot of that came from the 1976 San Francisco Parapet Ordinance. And to my knowledge, that's one of the first sort of mandatory sort of retrofit ordinances from a local government. And so I did a lot of work bracing parapets like this one, doing retrofits of unreinforced masonry buildings. And one thing that we saw from the Loma Prieta earthquake is that sort of very cost-effective mitigation was very effective in preventing things like this that happen. And I think that a lot of these local communities that were affected by the Loma Prieta earthquake followed suit with programs similar to San Francisco. Here's and we've seen some pictures of the Cyprus Freeway. Here's another one. And this structure, and there are a lot of building structures, particularly those that were constructed prior to the 1973 building code that was kind of informed by the 1971 San Fernando earthquake. These this non-ductile concrete construction, so you see these brittle failures here. And it's actually interesting for me in that right now I'm involved in doing a retrofit of a non-ductile concrete building in San Francisco. And really the analysis tools that we have to understand the behavior, model the behavior of these structures, and also the materials has evolved quite a bit. In fact, one of the materials that we use now is carbon fiber reinforced polymer wraps to increase the confinement of that concrete and the strength of it. So that's something that I'm involved with actually presently. And then here's a picture of a failure of a tilt-up warehouse, and I believe this is near Watsonville as well. And so this is also a type of building that's very vulnerable. In particular, it's the connection between the tilt-up concrete walls and the anchorage to the roof structure. And for me personally, actually after the 1987 Whittier earthquake, I was involved in the repair of quite a number of these types of tilt-up buildings in Whittier that were damaged in that earthquake, and certainly not as badly as this one. They were repairable, but I was involved in doing a lot of that. And then so 2 years later, we saw some of these things happen again after the Loma Prieta earthquake. But what really sort of shined the spotlight on this type of a vulnerable building was the Northridge earthquake 5 years later. And if you look actually at the evolution of the code, even in the last 30 years, the evolution of the provisions to strengthen that connection and to understand better the behavior of these types of, really common types of buildings has evolved quite a bit since that time. So there's been a lot of actually research and engineering into this type of a failure and this type of vulnerable structure. And so here we have the Marina District, and so as was mentioned previously, this is sort of the combination of poor soil and soil conditions, and then also this type of soft story construction where you have very rigid superstructure from all of the walls in the units above, and a relatively open parking level. And so you see that that causes a stiffness discontinuity at that first level, and you see a lot of displacement at that first level. And you see pictures from the Marina District where a lot of these buildings actually collapsed in the fires, the subsequent fires. And so it's also interesting to me that I actually lived just a few blocks from this building 2 months prior to the Loma Prieta earthquake. So actually in August, right before the Loma Prieta earthquake, I moved to Davis because that's when I started. I sort of suspended my engineering practice, and then I went back to school to get my PhD at UC Davis. And so I missed the Loma Prieta earthquake. I was in Davis. The only thing I saw was the light fixture above my table. My kitchen table sort of moved around in Davis, and then I turned on the World Series game, and I saw some of what happened. And I actually had a lot of friends, obviously, in the Marina District and in San Francisco. And it's kind of interesting is that one friend who lived on sort of the other side of Broadway and Fillmore Street on the other side of the hill, and took Muni home that day, and didn't even know the earthquake occurred because it was on a Muni bus at the time. So anybody who's ridden on a Muni bus kind of understands that an earthquake you probably wouldn't feel that when you're on the Muni bus. And so he turned on the game, and that's when he actually found out. And then another friend of mine who lived close by where I lived in the Marina had passed under the Cyprus structure maybe 10 minutes before it collapsed, and was on the Bay Bridge when and just before the collapse of that upper deck. And so he was actually able to drive backwards and get over the San Rafael Bridge, and because he lived in the Marina, he was able to get there. But he said that it was just eerie on the San Rafael Bridge. It looked like a meteor or something. It hit the Marina District. Everything was dark except for the fires. So it was a lot of it. So I thought I was pretty fortunate at the time to miss the earthquake. But again, I sort of missed out on this experience of this. And really, I've lived in California all my life, and I've never really felt an earthquake that was significantly strong like this. And so, but again, subsequently, I've gotten involved in a lot of work that's related to Loma Prieta and some of the events afterwards. And so this is actually kind of a slide that's a look forward which is showing some of the research that's ongoing right now that we are able to do now. We can actually understand the behavior of a lot of these vulnerable structures much better by being actually able to do full-scale testing of these structures. And so this is actually a recent test. This is the NIST soft story research program at UC San Diego. And you can see that it's interesting in that the test structure is very similar to the structure in the picture there. You see the bay windows, and they tested this to collapse. When I first started in my engineering practice, there was research done was mostly on component pieces of structure. So now we can do the component testing and marry that with the full-scale testing. And in fact, my colleague Kurt McMullen back there and I were involved. I think it was about 20 years ago. The Curie Caltech research program was more wood frame structures in general, but had component testing and also full-scale testing, and that was also at UC San Diego. So it's kind of exciting to understand that we can do this testing, and we can learn more about the behavior of these structures sort of going forward. And my last slide here gives a little perspective on where we are as far as understanding the accelerations that we can design for at the base of our structures. And I actually made a scan of a page out of my 1985 Uniform Building Code there. And that's a seismic map of the entire US. And you can see that there's 5 seismic zones. And then 20 years later, you see the level of detail in that same area. And that's really a map of the shaking really at the bedrock level. The USGS was instrumental in doing a lot of this of these contour maps, and then also we're able to factor in also the soil conditions at the site and the amplification of that bedrock motion, so we can understand as engineers a lot better what sort of acceleration demand we see really at the base of the structure. And I think it was mentioned, performance-based engineering was mentioned by our keynote speaker. And really that's sort of the goal, I think, of the structural engineering community and really community at large, is to be able to really engineer for performance and working with clients and owners as to being able to design a building or a structure to perform the way that it's desired. And I don't think we're quite there yet, but we have a lot of the pieces in place to reach that objective. And so with that, I think I'm ready to turn it over to our main presentation here. And I think it's Dan Goodrich from the Mineta Transportation Institute is our next speaker.
I think that honor actually belongs to Ann. All right. Okay, my turn?
Yeah, I don't know. I think James's presentation is next. So, Franny, should I just go through
Cycle
his?
through it?
One slide.
Oops.
Is that your
Last one? Yeah, there we go.
Okay. All right.
Okay, thank you. I love this picture. 1989, most people remember it. Bay Bridge. You're talking about 1930s construction. The base wasn't even anchored. They actually had to do a friction build on it back in the 1930s because they couldn't reach bedrock. So they simply pile drive piers down into it and then turn around and built upon it from there. So when you start thinking about that from 1930, that it was able to turn around and take that kind of damage, and it stayed up. But here's what's kind of interesting about this. It wasn't just the top that collapsed. The bottom did too. If you turn around and you take a real close look at that picture, you can see the bottom portion of the span gave way as well, buckled underneath it. Anybody here know what kept the whole thing from just falling down? Sir?
It landed on like a transformer or something with that, right?
AT&T communications cable. That's what kept it from going into the drink. So, Ann, thank you for stealing my thunder. Okay? No, honestly, I definitely feel like I'm not in the woods, screaming out in the dark. it's something where when you talk about bridges, when you talk about transportation, you're talking about having to put in infrastructure in places that you have no other choice but to do that on. And as a result, there's usually a leeway put on it as well for other things. In fact, there's one bridge in California inventory that is heavy rail. It is also a freeway. It also has a petroleum line, a communications line, and I'm trying to remember the other thing that's got running across it. If it were to go down, I'm sorry? Fiber optic line. If it was to go down, it would have an impact in the entire region of the state, not just in the immediate area. So it's kind of difficult to turn around and look at infrastructure. It's like what Ann was saying. It's very difficult to measure what the actual impact of an event is, because you may have something that you're looking at as simply being a local resource that has a region-wide impact because it has a resource going across it or is using it as a conduit for some other reason, and it has a much broader impact than we initially give it credit for. So let's go back memory lane. You're gonna turn around and pick up that little pamphlet that you've got in front of you and go all the way to the back. We've got modern cell phone evolution. Take a look at the dates. 1989. We got a population base, and this is based on USGS, or I'm sorry, US Census Bureau. 247 million. We only had 3 million cell phone subscriptions then. And it was first generation. And if you look at it from just a couple of years before, from back in 2085, you're only looking at, what was this? 340,000 phones, cell phones in circulation. Now, let's skip up to today. You're dealing with a population base, and I realize that some of you are looking at this and going, this is a little low. I've seen it as high as 350 million. Again, US Census, 329 million, and we have 441 million cell phone subscriptions. How many of you are carrying 2 or 3 devices on you right now? Okay, so this is what's going on. You know, I need to go back and do a little bit more research on this. This kind of piqued my interest because I'm not sure how many of the tablets that are in circulation right now have their own committed numbers as well, just for the communications points. But you turn around and you look back at where we were at in 1989, and we had 2 real big things that were going on back then. We had power. All right, still have that, no problem. Then we had the phone, which was usually a landline. Now, as of course, what we're talking about is 3 million cell phones running around in there. We also had about 22 million pagers. That's throughout the world, not just the U.S. In fact, the joke back then was that you're either a doctor, a drug dealer, or a cop if you had a pager, right? We peaked in our pager use in about 1996, and it hit about 63 million. That's again worldwide. Motorola stopped producing them sometime in 2001 to 2003. It's not that they're not out there, there still are, and they're actually a very good, viable communications means. But the problem is that, again, everybody has their smartphone, so why do you need to have this? So we got rid of it, or it's been dying. In fact, there's a whole industry on refurbing those old pagers and bringing them back into service. And I'm not talking about the newer ones that were just the alphanumerics, but the old numerics, and also just the ones that were just beep at you. That wouldn't give you any information. You had to call up a central number. But we had a transition that was going on. Anybody remember the old rotary dial phones? That technology went back to the 1890s. 1890s. So the thing had been in circulation for almost 100 years when they started phasing the things out in the early 1980s, and it continued into the 1990s. In fact, some of those systems stayed in circulation until they were basically erased over the next, over the current transition to voice over IP. How did we work back then? Geez, talking about barbaric. All right. You'd have an event occur. You may hear about it on the radio, you may feel it, you may see it, what have you. If you wanted to find out what was going on with it, you tuned in on the radio. Wow. Okay, well, that still exists. At least I hope it still does. All right? But what happens if we had to get hold of somebody? Well, then we had to find a payphone. When was the last time you saw a payphone?
A useful one?
useful one, a usable one. You pick it up and you actually get a dial tone.
Clarification.
Who actually knows any phone numbers now?
We're going to be getting to that. That's where it gets even more insidious. So what would happen is you turn around and you find said payphone, and you either have a bunch of dimes and quarters with you, or you have a prepaid phone card. How many of you remember prepaid phone cards? Okay, so this is where it starts getting, whoa, what happened to all this? What about the Thomas guys? Well, if you were going to some new part in the city or whatever, and you'd never been there, somebody gave you an address, you turn around and break this thing out, and you turn around and look up the street name way in the back of the index. It'd give you a page number of the map, and then it would give you a grid like A3. You turn around and flip to that page, you turn around and look in the block A3, which is about 2 inches by 2 inches. You'd find it, and then if you really had to, you'd go all the way to the front, pull out the big map that would give you the map of the whole region, and then you turn around, okay, I'm here, gotta work there, all right, I can use the freeway, I can do this, I can do that. How do you used to navigate? When was the last time you saw a Thomas guy? How many of you even remember the Thomas guy or street map? Okay? They're still around, but you gotta special order them. Okay? Ham radio analog. Man, some of them, a lot of the systems back then were crystal. This is actually state of the art, circa 1989. Year that this came out. Yaesu FT 470. Okay? My colleague in the back turned around and bought this used in about circa 1991, 92 for about 250 bucks. That's $250, 1991 dollars. Be over 400 bucks now. Talk about inflation, okay? The interesting thing about it, the modern equivalency, this, as you can tell, is a little bit smaller, all right? You can buy on Amazon, I checked this last night, by the way, for a little over 27 bucks. I can buy the complete system with a base charger and the battery and everything else for what a replacement battery for this thing will now cost. Same capability. VHF, UHF, ability to dial in on FM. Sorry for stealing part of your desk. Okay. So the costs on this stuff have dropped a lot, but what I mean by analog is that with these old systems, you had to manually preset the frequencies that if you wanted it. This one has 42 channels, so you can turn around and program each one of them. You have to turn around and punch in the frequency number and then have it coincide with that actual number, and you'd have to manually punch this thing in. The newer ones, the digital ones, I can turn around and hook a cable up onto this thing, hook it onto a laptop, get some freeware software on this thing, turn around and load up 128 channels onto this radio. Again, 27 bucks versus 42 channels on that one for 250 bucks, 1991 dollars. So there's been a huge drop in cost. Intel 486, 33 megahertz. Who even remembers those? This is pre-Pentium days.
That was screaming.
Okay, that was absolutely screaming. In fact, if you had that computer in 1989, you were the big kid not on the block, but in the city, because most of them didn't start shipping until the next year, until 1990. There was an interruption in the chip manufacturing, so that thing was the big dog. It really was. Now we're up to the Intel i7, i9 series chips. I don't even know how fast those things are now. In fact, I believe my replacement that's going to be stepping up here is going to be talking about some of the chips as far as what their capabilities are. So what do we transition to? Well, guess what? We're going more over to the internet protocols of things. Why? Because it's cheaper. If you remember back in the day, if you had a phone plan, you definitely waited till the weekend and preferably Sunday night to do any long distance calls. You don't do that anymore. I've got a plan that voice over IP where it's in this, I think it's in Wyoming, of all places. I'm paying 11.5 bucks a month for it, and again, I'm a Luddite on this too. I know somebody's going to go, you can do it cheaper than that. You can do it for free, blah, 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 blah. I've got 800 unlimited minutes per month. And it's got call blocking on it and a bunch of other features on it that I never could have imagined back in 1989. Still get those robocalls, but, okay, still there. All right, smartphones, data, all of it's transitioning to internet protocol. Why? Because it's a pre-existing network system that you can turn around and now leverage. It makes the system cheaper for whoever is now providing the service. Here's the kicker with verbal communications. 50% of what's said on the phone is silence. So you're transmitting silence. So by doing it this way, they turn around and are able to compress the signal. It makes it the whole thing more efficient. It makes the whole process more efficient across the board when you start talking about data being included as well with voice. So it has blended together very nicely. It's reduced all kinds of costs. It's made things extremely cheap. Voice over IP, oh, I'm going over? Okay, I'll pick it up. Okay. Skip forward, global positioning systems. Yes, they have their dates going back into the 1970s. The first time I ran across one was 1988 in the Marine Corps. You had to turn on the device and wait 30 minutes for it to turn around and generate a signal as far as where you were at.
And sometimes scrambled ones.
Yeah, and sometimes you had to turn it off and reboot it at the end of the process because it still wasn't correct.
That's
Right.
scrambled.
Now we get upset when you fire the thing up on your smartphone and the thing doesn't lock on within the first 10 seconds. All right? But think about the dependency. Does anybody, quick orientation here. North, south, east, west. Can anybody tell me where Rookwood Avenue is by pointing to it? Oh, without pulling up your smartphone? Okay. What about Post Street? That way. Okay, so I got a few people that respond that way. Rookwood is actually that way. All right, but this is the dilemma with this, is that we have become so dependent on these things. The first thing that we will die for is our smartphone to try and figure out what's going on. And oh, by the way, the technology, if you're pulling it up through Google Maps or Waze or what have you, now you're talking about it not only being having to get the satellite signals to figure out where you're at, but you're also having to log on to the internet as well to turn around and pull down that data. Unless you've got a standalone piece of software like Cyject or something like that, which emulates Garmin/TomTom. All right, as far as standalone devices. We've already covered the satellite phones. Here's the difficult part with satellite phones when you're talking about a disaster. A lot of people think that, oh, no problem, I'll have it and I'll have access to it. Here's the problem. One, you have to have access visually straight to the satellite. The other problem is that the satellite companies themselves have oversold the use of those phones. Same way that a cell phone company has, same way that the landline companies has. It's somewhere around 10 to 15%. Once you eclipse that, you're now in a situation where you're having to go into a holding pattern for somebody to drop off before you can start using it. If you've ever heard of the Getz cards, the whole point with them is to turn around and bump you up in the line. I realize I'm covering this in general. Okay. So what are the trends? Well, we are leveraging the existing infrastructure and technology. We don't abandon things, we turn around and look at how we can exploit them to the max. The phone lines that you used to have running into your house were a twisted two-pair line that would run in. They turn around and were able to leverage those up until a couple of years ago by compression of the bandwidth and everything else to allow Wi-Fi connectivity over it. They're being phased out because they're no longer capable of doing it. All right? So this is where we only abandon when we don't have any other choice. Otherwise, we will turn around and push it and push it and push it until it will hit the wall. We're going more and more with consolidated technology. I see a couple of tablets in here. Do you have hard drives in those? Where are you storing all your data? Cloud? Okay, real great. If you lose the device or whatever, not a problem. You haven't lost any work. Where's the cloud? Somewhere out there is the hard drive where your information is really being stored. It may be next door, it may be in New Jersey, it may be in China. So depending on what's going on, you may or may not have access to it. The older Luddites, like myself, we prefer an actual old-fashioned laptop with an old-fashioned hard drive on it where we've got it. Loss on that is a possibility as well. If I were to turn around and have it stolen, if I were to drop it or whatever, definitely need to back it up. But again, this is the transition that's occurring. What about 5G cell towers? Well, this is the most insidious part of all. We're talking about 5G being the gateway where they're going to start incorporating the Wi-Fi into it across the board. So in other words, you're not going to need to have your router at home anymore. You'll be able to actually access the device directly to the internet via the tower. But that puts a burden on the tower. 4G, you could handle up to 100,000 devices for 1 square kilometer. 5G, you're talking about 1 million devices. 6G, I don't even want to know where they're going with that. But again, we're looking at greater and greater connectivity. I don't know how much I really want to have my refrigerator and my microwave and my dishwasher talking to each other via the internet through an open system. But that's where we seem to be going with the Internet of Things. We're already past the 25 billion mark, by the way, by a couple of years. Well on our way. So from an emergency management perspective, we're dealing with a real problem as far as resiliency is concerned. Human factors, again, the whole point with the map, the whole point with being able to call somebody up via rote memory. Again, how many phone numbers do you know? And I'm not talking about your home phone number that you give out to everybody or your work number that you give out to everybody. I'm talking about their numbers. Do you have the old little black book in the back of your head someplace? No, we've lost it. Why? Because we haven't had to exercise it. We have it on our phones. Okay? Landlines, they've gone the way of the dodo bird. We're now in a situation where we are relying more and more on voice over IP, which again goes back to the whole twisting of the systems and the incorporation of it. There is greater and greater requirements being pulled from the grid to turn around and enable our connectivity than ever before, and as a result, it becomes even more critical. One of the telltale signs from the power grid, the PG&E over this last couple of weeks, was the whole thing with cell towers. Yes, we have a problem with them potentially collapsing in earthquakes, but I'm looking at more than just earthquakes. I'm thinking of floods. I'm thinking of fires. I'm thinking about all kinds of things. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with the telecommunications industry, they don't really like to talk about how things work. In fact, one of our old colleagues, Dale Foster, who was the chief of fire down south before he retired, turned around and got a presentation a couple of months before the fiber optic lines were cut in 2009. Anybody remember that incident? Somebody got into the vaults and chopped up 4 of the lines. Okay, well, he got a briefing from AT&T a couple of months beforehand saying, oh, not a problem, we'll be able to roll in one of the cows and we'll be able to cover the problems, no sweat. Well, they quickly found out that without those fiber optic lines, the whole system was dead, and it was for several days until they repaired the lines. Some of you remember that incident. So, again, we're dealing with greater and greater dependency on this. So, what happens when we get to the early warning system? Well, it's exactly what Ann has to say earlier. And that is that we are dealing with a very, very complex system where you have the accelerometers that are going to turn around and pick up what's going on with the P waves, the primary waves and the secondary waves. They're going to turn around and have to get those from a couple of different places. They're going to pull it into a central part where they're going to have to run it through a computer with a bunch of algorithms. Wouldn't have been able to do this a few years ago because of the complexity of the programming as well as the speed necessary for the processors. So you're talking about a connection from this device and this device to this, then the connection from this device over to the media release and announcement. Think about all the connections that are involved with this. Just to get this computer to talk to the internet, I've got to have 6 or 7 layers of software running in order to make it work. Imagine how complex this is. Now don't think for an instant we don't need it, we do. In 2011, when the tsunami hit Japan, JL West lost 5 trains. In fact, 2 of those trains, they never found them. They turned around and went out over the deep end of the ocean and went in and they just disappeared. You know how many people they lost? 0. Because the system automatically shut the trains down and the conductors on those trains knew that they had to evacuate the personnel to higher ground. That was part of their base plan. It was built into it. This isn't just about having the communications capabilities. It's also having the knowledge of what to do with that information. Just because you have greater connectivity doesn't mean that you're in a better shape. You have to have a plan on how you're going to exploit it. Now the thing with this system is, yeah, we may only get one bite at the apple, but I'll tell you what, if I was a surgeon and I was right in the middle of something, somebody's brain, somebody's guts, and all of a sudden I had 6 seconds warning, that's a lifetime. That's literally a life. I might be able to do something in that. Or if I'm a cop sitting underneath an overpass, being able to move my patrol car out during that time frame, so I don't have to worry about the bridge falling literally on me in the process. Yes, it's got 2 Achilles heels. One, if you're at the center of it, it's going to be a bad hair day because you're not going to receive any warning. We've been living without any warning up until now. The other part of it is the complexity of the system, where we may only get one warning out of it. We may not get anything dealing with the aftershocks. But you know what? We know that they're going to be aftershocks, so we can work with that information. Sorry for going over, Franny. Better hand this over to Ash. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. By way of introduction, I'm Ash Padwell. I'm the Chief Risk Officer for a local technology company. And as part of my day job, I manage a whole portfolio of risks, one of which is cybersecurity risks. And I manage them both at the state, local, national, and the global level. So what I'm going to do, when I was asked to come speak on this topic and say, give me give you folks a cybersecurity perspective of what could happen in the event of a large earthquake, I went about researching the Bay Area and how the Bay Area has changed, because in the world of cybersecurity we talk about risk profiles. So I wanted to see how the risk profile for the area has changed. And typically when you look at how risk profiles alter or change, you look at what is going to make the area a more desirable target for the bad actors. What are the vulnerabilities that may have crept into the system? What are the threats that have grown out there in the time since Loma Prieta? And most importantly, what are the attack surfaces? So as I started researching that, one of the things I found out was not only has the Bay Area changed, but something very significant has happened in the Bay Area. The Bay Area has changed the world. So I'm going to cover 3 areas, and I'm going to give you a lot of raw data that I used in drawing some of the inferences I've drawn. And I'm happy to answer questions if you have along the, in between, or Franny, you can tell me to have them hold the questions until later. What has changed? And lastly, what are the new aftershocks? So going back to the topic I gave, the heading I gave this, the aftershocks that I'm going to talk about are not your geological aftershocks. They're going to be man-made aftershocks that are going to happen, are likely to happen, and it's not a question like most of you in the earthquake business talk about if there's going to be an earthquake, but when there's going to be an earthquake. Similarly, in the world of cybersecurity, we talk about it's not a question of if you're going to get hacked, but when you get hacked, how are you going to respond to it, right? So let's look at some of the data, how the Bay Area has changed the world, because not only has the Bay Area changed, but we, a lot of us, our neighbors, those of us who've been in 30 years, have changed the world in many respects. And let me start by giving a lot of credit to our former Vice President Al Gore. I was lucky enough to work with him in 1991 when he was helping pass the High Efficiency Computing Act. SB 272 is what I remember it as. But that really enabled us to commercialize what was until then an academic and a research internet, right? And so once the internet comes on the scene, the Bay Area starts to take off. So this was one of the slides Dan was referring to. In 1989, we had about 1 million transistors per second. The 486 computer had approximately 1 million transistors on the chip. And look where we are today in 2018. We've got over 50 billion transistors on a chip, okay? Clock speeds have gone from 10 million hertz to 10 billion hertz. And this is all in the span of the last 30 years or so. Storage capacity has gone from 1 megabyte to 10 terabyte in the same unique space. Computing efficiencies have increased enormously. right? And this year is another Bay Area creation. Some of you might recall this was the next computer that Tim Berners-Lee used to create the world's first web server, right? And that's what takes off on the internet. So this is 30 years and how the Bay Area has changed, and it's changed the world. Growth of internet usage, you know, so starting with 1990, 1991, that's when we start seeing the internet come about into the commercial space. But in 1996, another seminal event happens, and that's the passage of the Telecom Deregulation Act. And that takes off internet usage from about 3 billion human, you know, from less than fractional human users to 3 billion human users worldwide today. Look at the number of internet users by country, and I've got 1991 was the earliest data that I could get to where it is today, right? And again, we in the Bay Area, I'd like to take credit for, we're responsible for making this happen. So what percentage of the world's population was using the internet? Next to nothing, right, all around the world, and then look what's happened in 2017. Mobile cellular subscriptions by country. Look what's happened in 2017, right? Technology adoptions in US households, and look where we are today. You know, Facebook, the social media platforms are up at top. So this is again a Bay Area phenomenon that has transformed the world. I'm sorry, this was the different types of television services, and this is the use of social media platforms. This is one of the most interesting slides that you see. This is about commoditization of technology. Starting in 1997 or thereabouts, and this coincidentally happens to be around the time when we started looking at permanently normalizing trade relationships with China, right? And China gets entry into the WTO in 2000 or so, and look what happens to the price of technology. It starts to fall while everything else is rising. So this is what, up until now, we've been talking about how the Bay Area has changed the world, but what has that done to the Bay Area? Well, it's made us very rich. It's made us very affluent. We're probably one of the most affluent areas around the world, but from a cybersecurity perspective, that's bad, and I'll tell you why. So look at this. This is the median home price in the Bay Area, right? Has gone from about $300,000 to over $1 million in Santa Clara County alone. This year is the number of civilian job workforce. Now what is interesting is the unemployment levels back then and today are the same. But the number of people in the workforce were different, so those percentages are misleading to some degree. So again, what that has done is it has altered our cybersecurity risk profile. It's made us a more attractive target for bad actors, because I don't know who it was Bonnie and Clyde or one of those earlier bank robbers who said, why do you rob banks? Well, they said that's because that's where the money's at, right? So cybersecurity risks follow something along that same pattern. People attack cybersecurity targets because that's where the money's at. So if money's the motivation, we've got some fears to realize. So what are the new aftershocks? But before we get into the specific aftershocks, just let me tell you what this is. This is the triad that you talk about in cybersecurity: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And when either one of these are disrupted, you have disclosure, destruction, or alteration of data. And if we realize that data is the most valuable commodity that we deal with today and will continue to get even more valuable in the future, you can see what kind of an economic impact cybersecurity risks could have on the region and also on the state. So coincidentally, when I'm asked to talk about cybersecurity, I use geological metaphors, right? In geology, you have the epicenter, which is what is the representation of the source of the earthquake at the surface level, but the focus is where the earthquake really, the ground is really shifting. And so think about for a minute our enterprises as civil structures, as building structures, right? You got the ground underneath, which is your IT infrastructure, and the more digitally transformed we become, the more we continue to rely on our IT infrastructure. And the IT departments are kind of the first floor of your building. And then the rest of the departments of your organization, the rest of the divisions of your operation are all the stores. So when you have a seismic event in the IT infrastructure, you feel the waves ripple across the entire enterprise. And by the way, this enterprise, even though it looks like they're all physically co-located, could be a global enterprise, right? But then it gets even more interesting. So think about what happens. These ripple effects are felt throughout your entire supply chain and distribution chain. So there is a coincidental, there's a correlation here between how earthquakes propagate and how cybersecurity events propagate. Here's some data on the number of data breaches that we've seen, and this is only since 2005. Right? The number of data breaches are going up. This is data breaches that are reported by federal agencies. And by the way, all the data that we have, all the statistics that we have on data breaches is all about reported data breaches. And that's, by some accounts, only a fraction of the actual data breaches that are taking place out there, because folks are not reporting a lot of those data breaches for whatever reason. This is how the bad guys think, right? This is what they do. They recon, they weaponize their exploits, they deliver their exploits, then they actually have the event where they exploit the infrastructure, they install, they command and control, and they exfiltrate data. So this is what the bad guys do. And why is that important? Because what we've seen since 1989, 1990 is an evolution of the threat landscape. So the threats, so we talked about the risk profile changing because the valuation of our assets has gone up, so it makes us more attractive targets. But what has also happened is that the threat landscape has changed. So the folks who are trying to exploit incidents and events have grown from being amateur, what we call as amateurs who are doing it for whatever thing other than a commercial gain, to state actors on the right-hand side. So that's how the threat landscape has changed. What else do we know about the threat landscape? The threat landscape has been compounded by the fact that nowadays, the folks who are looking to exploit weaknesses are commercial enterprises. These are people who are on the other part of the world punching a clock, showing up at 8 o'clock in the morning with healthcare and benefits, looking to exploit our infrastructure over here. And don't be surprised if some of our stuff that is local here is high on their target list. They're constantly trying to figure out ways to breach and to wait for the right moment to exploit that infrastructure, right? So let's talk about, and Dan shared with you some of the attack surfaces that have changed since 1989. So here's an attack surface that has changed at our local intersections, right? We've got smart everything happening, but smart means there's an additional attack surface for the bad guys to try and attack and penetrate. Street signs, right? Everything's connected. Your buildings, bridges, and other infrastructure that have sensors built into them. So every time you think you're doing something or we're doing something to make our jobs easier, our lives easier, the bad guys are seeing that as another opportunity to exploit and to make our lives difficult. Somebody talk about street poles, right? Another attack surface. You got sensors built on there for whatever purpose. Somebody's going to figure out a way to either deny you the use of those sensors or send you false information, or even worse, put a ransomware on them and say, if you want to reuse these sensors, pay me money. And why is that important? Because again, we're going to autonomous vehicles. So in the event of an earthquake, our guards are going to be down. We're going to be busy trying to protect human life, put out fires maybe, and restore communications and rebuild our infrastructure. And that's unfortunately the time when the bad guys are most likely to attack. Again, this is your, the intelligent traffic management system. every single point of connectivity there is a potential source of a breach. Somebody mentioned public transit earlier. You know, that's a ransomware attack on a local public transit agency. You're going to be preventing the use of fare machines, fare boxes. If you have a connected ecosystem for cars, think about all the different directions from which that attack could come and disrupt the infrastructure. There's another one. And then there's always going to be pranksters. So here's one, right? Somebody takes over a roadside traffic sign. And these are real events. Right? So, in a nutshell, I think what we're going to do, we're going to have to deal with is how do we not only harden our brick and mortar infrastructure, but how do we harden our cyber infrastructure and make it ready to withstand what could be exploits that happen at our most vulnerable moments. When we're trying to deal with a natural disaster, whether it be earthquake, fire, flood, there's bad guys looking to exploit that. And then here's what we could do to prepare, right? There's a lot of folks here who are familiar with the OES systems that we have, and that's not my area of expertise. But as you consider OES responses at the state, local, and national level, you can look at adding cyber to that whole dimension. Because the other problem that we're going to have is, if you think 911 centers are inundated with all kinds of frivolous calls today, guess what? Don't be surprised if you start seeing calls to your 911 centers that say, you know, my internet's not working and my phone company's not answering. So, what do I do? Right? And so we've got to also be testing and practicing doing drills on cybersecurity. So again, in a nutshell, earthquakes and natural disasters expose a vulnerable underbelly of our infrastructure that can be exploited now for cybersecurity gains because we've connected everything. With that, I'll stop. Can I add one?
I think now we have some time for questions for our panel and also for our keynote speaker.
Just thinking about the quake warning piece, you kind of alluded to it, and I'd love kind of to double click on, given the time limited nature of the warning, and the many things that one would possibly want to do, what's your advice to those of us who manage these A to Z cities on kind of what we should be looking at in terms of thinking about first to taking advantage of that short amount of time? For example, one of the things that we're thinking about is getting our fire station doors up. Because if the fire station door isn't up, you can't roll your engines, and that requires power. And if the building moves, you can't get it up without power. But I'd love your thoughts on sort of taking advantage of that short period of time. What are the logical ways that we should at least be thinking about?
Want me to take that? Or I could do an initial overview. This is from an emergency management perspective. You start off with yourself. What's your immediate situation? What can I do to turn around and take care of myself? And then if there's any surplus time, the next thing that you go after is those that are immediately around you. As far as what can I do to turn around and help get them into a better situation. Third one is, what's the status of my family? And that is probably going to be a much broader question involving all kinds of communications assets to turn around and try and reach them to find out what exactly is going on. So in a situation like, all of it is situationally dependent. So in a situation that we'd be in right now, I wouldn't be worried about the building collapsing, but I would be worried about the immediate overhead turning around and striking us, which is where the old adage about seeking cover underneath your own desk or underneath the chair to protect your head and your upper torso as much as possible, is what you try and do. Because when you turn around and look at this, you've got a false ceiling immediately over you. Who knows what you've got in the way of electrical, conduits, gas lines, pipelines, all kinds of other things. I mean, even though you're dealing with fairly light panels, those things coming down at an angle and hitting you at the right angle could, cause some damage. So, you immediately be looking at, protecting yourself. And then it'd be a matter of trying to advise everybody around you to do the same thing under those circumstances. But this is where it gets kind of insidious with the early warning systems. 2011, the Japanese system was so effective that the notification they received in Tokyo was, 3 minutes, 2 minutes prior to? And this is where a lot of people actually looked at the advanced warning, and it went for so long before it actually hit, they thought it was a false alarm. So they started going about their normal business again, and then it was one of those, whoa, okay, and then they get hit with it. So this is one of those things where the technology that they had even 10 years ago couldn't have given you an idea of when this thing is going to strike. The technology that's coming out now does have that capability. So we're talking about, major steps, major gains in it. Now, as far as it being able to, give you a countdown on it, I'm not sure exactly where the program is on that. As far as where you're physically standing, whether it's going to be able to get to the point where it's going to say earthquake in 4, 5, or I'm sorry, earthquake in 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Yeah,
I wouldn't doubt that it would be able to at
Yeah,
that
sure.
point.
I mean, that was the original hope, right?
Yeah.
A part of the difficulty with earthquake early warning is that if you have a large earthquake, you'll get the P waves going out, but you actually don't know how big your earthquake's going to be. So it's going to change. The warning is actually potentially going to change over time. But we have a chapter on our scenario which explores your question, and certainly drop cover hold on is kind of the number one. In our scenario, we have 18,000 injuries. We calculated we could prevent 2,000 if people used Shake Alert and made themselves safer. So there's that potential there. The other ideas are automated control systems. So BART is already using it to slow the trains. PG&E has a setup for elevators. Elevators is a good one. If power goes out or the elevator gets stuck, but there's still problems with internet being able to control the elevator and the security problems we just heard, right, around that. And there's also examples in hospitals, which you mentioned. The people in hospitals in Southern California have been a pilot user. Fire doors going up, I've heard that one as well. Data centers thinking they could fail over a bit faster.
Along those same lines, the thought occurred, how much time do I have? Do I go to get out of the house or just duck and cover? With the warning sensors that are sensing the P wave, are there enough diversity in the sensors yet that you could do a radius of curvature and maybe find out the center of the first surface wave that may hit, give you some idea of the length of time?
Yeah, I think we can do that. We just don't know how big the earthquake is going to be. The network is very dense now, and so that part's working well. Does that answer your question? Don't run out the building. Unless you're on a URM, you don't want to run out the building because more things fall off of them. And don't stand under door jams. That's all old advice. It's getting down on the floor is a really good idea because you'll be thrown down otherwise.
Since we're so dependent on electricity, the internet, those are all going to be indicators and vulnerabilities of ours. So what would be I think his question, I don't know if it was really answered, but it was if it's electronic and it's electricity pulled, how do you open the door to give, for the emergency preparedness, or, for fire department? How would they get out the door? Same thing as I live in a community where my garage is underneath, so my gates won't open. So how would I get out of the building if all those access points are not available to me?
Good question. You'd have to have backup power, or you'd have to get your shake alert and push the button to open the door before the shaking comes to you from your warning. And that's the idea.
Do you guys integrate with IFTT? With this and that? It's a freely available internet app that allows you to take a signal in and automatically do it out. So I have an IFTT alert every time my father emails me because I want to communicate with him and it gives me a text message. If you do an IFTT integration, I can integrate that with any automated system that I have in my home and could give it command based on a shake alert.
Right, I think the automated controls are doing that sort of thing.
Well,
Where you
that's-
don't need a human, yeah.
Right.
That's what's interesting about the technology and the propagation of it is that you do have that layering,
Yes.
that leveraging of pre-existing systems. So, voice over IP, all right? They started playing with that in its current form in about 1995. Yeah, there were designs that went back into the 1970s and everything else. But the reason why they were able to start experimenting with it in about 1995 was because something called HTTP had been developed a couple of years prior too. So you've got to have some precursor technology in place to turn around and be able to build off of, and that's what's going to happen with this. I don't doubt that in a very short period of time, maybe even 4 or 5 years, you're going to get to the situation where those automated systems will be built into it as far as, a forwarding of the message and a forwarding of the actions to be taken, out. That's the whole idea of the integration of all of the technology in the first place, is being able to leverage it and use it in different ways. I mean, we never would have thought that the accelerometer that was put into these things that would allow you to turn around and just rotate the screen, being able to read it, could also be used for monitoring seismic activities if it's sitting on something solid. Does it get an accurate signal? Not anywhere near as as your calibrated equipment, but it can pick up on that kind of thing. It can pick up on movement. So it's a matter of taking that and then looking at it and going, well, okay, how can we leverage this? In a lot of cases, though, when it comes to doors, you're also looking at fire codes that come into play. So some of the things that you're looking at as far as the alarm systems that lock down the door hard, or let's say it has a magnetic lock on the door, well, when the power goes, you're not going to have any juice to turn around and energize that power or that magnet anyway. The door is going to spring open. So there is also that factor into it. It's the intuitive, and in some cases counterintuitive thought processes that sometimes need to be explored in order to figure out how to leverage these things. Does that help explain part of what you're looking at, or?
Well, it's a gate that it just opens close. I can't push it out, right?
Okay, but is it controlled electronically?
Yeah.
Okay. Odds are what's controlling it then is a magnetic lock. And this is coming over from the security side more, but it does have an overlap with it. So what happens is the default on those doors for safety reasons will, when the power dies, by default the door is now open. So you have to look at that. The locking doors that they have at like 7-Elevens where you walk in and they have these magnetic plates up on the top of it. They can hold 600 pounds, but once they lose juice, the door swings open. So it may be a matter of working at from that as far as power failure, equals safety, gives it a default. Give you an idea of this thought process. Rail, when they lose air pressure in the lines, in the brake systems, the brakes lock up. It's not the other way around. You don't have to use pressure to turn around and activate the brakes. It's lack of pressure that activates the brakes. So it's, again, putting it into a counterintuitive process.
I think there was a question in the back.
No, actually, just going to comment about that very similar thing. So on a campus here, where campus, security locks are designed that way that you lose power. There's certain doors that are exit only, and you can always get out of that. You don't need to code. If you go into a certain place, they go in happy backup, they have these options, or they're manual compass in the place. So you don't actually go security.
Yeah, they also design it that way to allow fire to make ingress into the system so that they can then turn around and fight whatever.
Which is a big problem for us in the power shutoff, because all of those systems go down and everything is accessible.
Yeah, and that's where Ash's side comes into play with this. A lot of people will turn around and look at this and go, well, what's the likelihood of a bunch of hackers turning around and hitting us right after an earthquake? 15 years ago, yeah, probably not. Nowadays, I'm looking at it and going, yeah, when you get the number of state actors that are out there looking at this stuff and looking for vulnerabilities, and the real problem is always getting the system to work. That's the primary emphasis. It's not the security on it. It's not the robustness of it. It's just getting it to work. So when you talk about a situation where we've had, you know, a massive impact on our infrastructure, we've had massive loss of power, and we're now having to go with on-the-spot hotspots where we're immediately standing things up just with generators and then tying them into the existing system, however it's still working. We're now creating points of vulnerability that somebody else can come in and piggyback off of and leapfrog into the main system and wreck it. So that's where it becomes more problematic, and that becomes a point where we need to be looking at the systems becoming more robust, and we also need to start looking at how to incorporate security into the process while it's being built back up or being, you know, ad hoc at the time. It's not an easy thing to do.
Anyone else have questions for now? Yes.
I have a quick Ash. Really terrified and appreciate your perspective on this. What would you suggest? You've had a lot of experience in helping people think about this. What would you suggest is the best way to get people who don't think about this on a daily basis, and who maybe don't necessarily have a high level of technical sophistication, but we're going to be deeply impacted by this, to begin to grok it and begin to pay attention to it?
Well, education certainly helps, but let me go back to the earlier discussion that your question prompted. I think there is a point at which we have to stop relying entirely on technology, right? I'm saying that as an engineer with 2 engineering degrees, but the over-reliance on technology can sometimes lead us down pathways that makes it hard for us to use our common sense. So, you know, there's going to be a world with this new app that the governor just released. There's going to be a world of millennials, and I don't mean to pick on any one demographic, that's going to think that if that app doesn't ring, there's no earthquake coming, right?
Yeah.
They might lose their common sense ability to handle stuff. So the over-reliance on technology, and I don't want to sound like a Ted Kaczynski here, but there is a point at which reliance on technology can have negative effects, or can lull us into a false sense of security, and that's what we have to educate people on. That technology has its flaws. Technology is not perfect. It does make our life easier, but at some point. And then, you know, in my job, unfortunately, I've got to think about the worst in humanity. You know, what are the bad guys going to do? What are the bad guys, how are they going to exploit this? So when the governor announces a new app, I'm thinking, well, great. So there's people in China, North Korea, Iran, you know, Russia, who are saying, well, we got one more place to go after and try to destabilize California's economy. So education, and then, you know, we got to use a lot of common sense, and I don't know how you teach common sense or how you legislate common sense.
I do very much like your idea of doing the drill, and I think doing the drill in combination with, and exercising it in combination with the normal emergency response will be very interesting, because to your point, all we're worried about is getting systems up.
Right, exactly.
We start throwing out all sorts of stuff that we wouldn't normally share, and become extremely vulnerable. If you did an inject in that of like, wait a minute, now your system is locked down because you lit somebody inside, that would be very eye-opening.
You know what? One thing I didn't get the chance to talk to you about is there's different levels of cybersecurity readiness in our society. The financial services sector, for obvious reasons, because their business is about cybersecurity, about IT transactions, is probably the best prepared sector that I've seen. And they conduct some enormous cybersecurity drills, and they find little things like, you know, Dan mentioned, you know, or somebody else had also mentioned, that we don't remember phone numbers anymore. So when you ask a whole bunch of non-IT professionals, what would you do? How would you contact Dan? They'll say, oh, well, I'll call his phone number, but guess what? His phone's down. You don't have a phone to call him with. How else will you call him? And there's a bit of a blank stare. So you'll identify gaps in your preparedness that you would have otherwise taken for granted.
Take this away from them for 48 hours and see how much they wig.
I think back there,
No,
yes, yeah, it was for yeah.
I was wondering, on the lines of satellite communication, I understand there's times when we're expecting more sunspot activity that might interfere with that. Is that anything real, or is that, just something that doesn't affect anything?
No, it does. In fact, I'm not an expert on those technologies, but there is some serious threats about solar flares is what I think you're referring to, disrupting communication systems. Because, as sophisticated and as advanced we think we are, we're still only, crawling in the world of technology. We still have to walk, and then we can afford to run. So we don't know what the impacts of those things are going to be.
I'm trying to remember the old cyber warfare line where the guys were talking about, every time we think that nobody is willing to drill down to that level in the programming to find a vulnerability, some 14-year-old kid in Norway does. And that's kind of the problem with this. It's not just the state actors. I mean, it'd be easy to turn around and say, well, yeah, we're worried about China or Russia turning around and scrambling our GPS system, which would do all kinds of nasty things to us, believe me. I mean, we have become extremely dependent upon it. But what happens when we're dealing with some kid, some non-state actor, who turns around and starts digging around in the programming, finds a vulnerability like Lovebug, and turns around and figures out a way of exploiting it, and then turns around and just by fiddling with it, by exploring it, turns around and crashes it. So that's where we're at with this. The whole, again, the emphasis has always been on, let's make it work. Let's get it to, get it out there. Let's get it to market. And then the problem is, well, how are we going to secure it? So, when you're dealing with the introduction of the smart cars, they found out that that's going to be a lot more phased in than anything. But you turn around and you take a look at how much control the computers have over the cars now. You go out and look at a car that's 10 years old, you'll find that the accelerator that you're stepping on is not physically connected to a carburetor fuel injector. Okay? It's a sensor that it's monitoring. The computer is then interpreting where your foot is in proximity on that sensor to indicate on how much power to give up the engine. Same thing with your transmission. You go to shift it into gear. You're not shifting manually the transmission into gear. It's a computer that's then turning around and feeding that information off of the sensor to the computer that's actually controlling the transmission to put it into gear. So when you start looking at that, all of a sudden you start realizing you're a lot less connected to stuff than we think we are. And that's where you end up with the situations where they can override the computers, feed it false information, and get the car to behave in a way that could potentially kill you. So that's where the fears come into play. Sorry.
I was just going to add a comment that similar to earthquake preparedness on the cybersecurity talk, particularly for corporation public entities, you have to have the mindset of when, not if. Because we're doing everything we can. We're at AC Transit, we're spending millions of dollars in cyber hardening, which is helpful, but one disgruntled employee, particularly one disgruntled employee in the IT department, can immediately bypass all of that. So, the system backups, drilling your organization to run without all of this technology, not making any technology decisions that you absolutely must have to deliver your mission. I really encourage my team to plan for when, not if. And we do all the backups we can do. Chunky public may not know, Union City has been down or was down for about 3 weeks on a ransomware attack, and it really crippled them. They couldn't even get their board agendas out. We still have typewriters. We had to. We could literally physically go post an agenda on the front door. We have the ability to run checks manually. We can still get our payroll out if we had to. You have to have this. You have your earthquake go bag. You need to have your cybersecurity plan to run without your cyber systems for at least a month.
Yeah, Mike, and you make a very good point. One of the things we often talk about is the new set of employees that are coming into our businesses and organizations. They've never experienced what the manual workflow was. So all they know about a certain job that they're doing is punching in keystrokes at a computer screen. And somehow the software and the application in the background is taking care of the workflow. So if you had to disrupt that workflow, a lot of our newer employees would never know how things get done manual. And that's a institutional knowledge that we're losing as our older employees retire, and that's a concern.
Isaac Asimov all over again.
Last of the question, more of a comment. I would touch on what you talked about taking the phone away, or being used to drilling for these sorts of things. The amateur radio world has obviously been doing this for 100 years with Field Day, right? Which is they force themselves to be off grid. And in the work that Ann and I did on the Hayward scenario, Telecom chapter, our recommendation for a day without power is essentially based upon the concept of Field Day. We recommend, pick a weekend, throw your breaker and see what happens for 24 hours. Can you live without power for 24 hours? And during the recent shutdowns, I know that was a big thing, and a lot of people were very upset. But I think there's a blessing in that. It forces everybody to do a day without power. And so there's a positive, right? I mean, it was not a good thing, but it was still a positive because it forced people to say, gee, I really don't own any flashlights. And I have like 3 D-cell batteries that have been sitting in a drawer for 9 years. And so they had to put some thought into it. But I think it validates that practice that the ham radio community has been doing for 100 years and puts that. Because if I say to my neighbors, hey, you guys should try turning off the power this weekend and see what happens, they'll be like, you're nuts. I'm not doing that. And my kids will never say yes to it. So I tell my teenagers I'm going to turn the Wi-Fi off for 15 minutes. I've got a revolution on my hands, right? So God forbid I turn it off for 24 hours.
There's an insidious part to the ham radio situation, and I didn't really start thinking about it until I started looking at this paper. But here's the basic problem. We had a hurdle you had to overcome in the way of cost if you wanted to get into ham radio, which made the group fairly exclusive for a period of time. But now, when you're dealing with something that you can pick up for $27 off of Amazon, and you've got people that are buying these things and throwing them into the glove box of their car as a false sense of security, thinking, well, in an emergency, I'll be able to use it. At the time of, they'll turn around and fire this thing up. And one of the reasons why RACES works, why the network works, is the discipline, is the protocol that's associated with it. Now we're talking about flooding.
Years to get RACES certified or something?
Yeah. But now you're talking about flooding the market with these. And at the
We
time
can have a whole debate about appliance operators and no codes and go down the amateur radio rabbit hole, right? I don't want to do that in front of this audience.
No, but I just bring it up because it's
But
something
you're right.
else you gotta
you're
consider.
absolutely right. The whole notion of it's the same kind of concept as somebody who says, well, I'm afraid of crime, so I'm going to go buy a gun and I'm going to stick it in a safe, and they never
practice
train.
with it.
And so then when something does happen, it's worse for them than if they just didn't have the gun at all.
And keep this in mind for those of you who are not on the ham side, okay? It is the most robust system and has been the only thing to weather every disaster that we've been through. It works, but it works because the participants that are using it are disciplined. They know their equipment. They know what the policies and procedures are as far as the use of that equipment. What I'm talking about is amateur hour happening at the time of, where everybody turns around and just fires one of these things up and starts using it haphazardly. That's where it gets dangerous. So it's process.
The thing that goes through my mind in a major earthquake, resources get very thin. So the thing that goes through my mind is mutual aid. Cities have to start supporting. Los Gatos suffers the most. Different cities have to provide equipment there to deal with the situation. So the thing that and it may spread out quite a distance. So the thing that goes through my mind is how standardized is the communication in terms of 10 codes and things of that sort. If you got mutual aid from, let's say, Oakland down to San Jose or Los Gatos, could their fire engine connect up to a fire hydrant there? The
Yes.
thinking is yes, but I don't.
Part of that, well, actually, Franny
Yeah, let me answer.
is probably the best.
So yes, because of Loma Prieta and following the 1991 fire 2 years later in Oakland, we created something called the Standardized Emergency Management System in California. And in the fire service, it's multiple volumes of directives. Fire hydrants are all color-coded, for example. So you know what kind of water you're getting or what kind of pressure based on the color. Also, the size of the hydrant connection is standardized across the state. So Oakland has super big hydrant openings because of their concern about wildland interface and the need to get more water on the fire. So they have to provide a coupler on the hydrant. So if one of their engines comes with the 10-inch hose, they take the coupler off and use the 10-inch hose. But the coupler's there so that every mutual aid company that comes has the 5-inch line and they can hook it up. So things like that have been established. 10 code is forbidden in SEMS. It's all plain text. So
Okay, like
everybody
racist.
has to speak just regular talk, because 10 code in the state of California has at least 5 different versions that I'm aware of, and there's probably many more than that. So you could cause all kinds of confusion. So if you just say what you want, I'm going to lunch, or I'm out of service, instead of 10-4, 10-26 and all that, that has proven to be the safest.
So in an earthquake, police and fire department talks plain text?
Yes.
Okay.
They're supposed to. Now, I wouldn't put money on the discipline of the cops. You know, I think they're gonna say what they're gonna say.
It's hard to unlearn 20 years of things.
Yeah.
But at least at the integration level, the incident commander is gonna be working with the EOC, and we're gonna be speaking plain English to each other. We're not gonna be doing 10 codes from an incident command post up to the EOC.
The cops, you're dealing with alpha personalities because of the nature of their work.
Yeah.
And
Right.
as such, they're used to working independently.
They forget they report to the city manager.
Yeah.
So we kind of moved forward already, but I wanted to make sure that everybody knew, we have a cabin up in the hills, and just recently when PG shut the power off, the cell sites went with it.
Yep.
So if there is a fire or we needed to evacuate, they would have no way of letting us know.
Yeah, that was one of the things that.
There was no cell towers, there were no cell service. Even if you had a generator and you could charge your phone and turn it on, there's no cell towers, no cell service.
This is one of the interesting things that came out of the whole PG&E planning process, and that is that Verizon and AT&T both came forward and said, we will be able to provide service as long as we have access to the towers, meaning that we can move generators into it or batteries as far as backup is concerned. So, yeah, when you're talking about a situation where there's a wildland interface fire or flood, they might be able to get in there. Earthquake, when you're talking about 1,700 road sections being blown out, it's going down.
So AT&T's gensets and cows come down from Reno or somewhere near there.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually happened to be talking on the day of the shutdown to AT&T executives, and they were rolling out of Reno, but that takes time. And a friend of mine who does fueling, in fact, Ann showed a photo of trucks with fuel tanks in her presentation. That was actually my friend that was Maria, and he was loading fuel into his truck, and he took that photo and sent it to me. But they were ready to go on an airplane, and then were told,
Not needed.
we don't need you, don't fly. But it takes time for that fueling and those gensets to come down. So there's gonna be a period of time initially when the power goes out that the telecom will be problematic and then gradually recover.
Which is why we're looking at how much of that we can pre-position here and what we can do within our existing negotiations.
Because we had, 3-4 days warning that they were gonna turn the power off, we knew.
Yeah, it was interesting. They didn't stage the stuff. They waited until it occurred and then they rolled and.
Actually,
they
we never got cell back.
They prioritized higher density areas. So they did provide backup in certain areas, but not others, and they threw out in the rural areas.
Just right there in Sonora.
Yeah, it's gonna be, the whole thing is gonna be situationally dependent on what they can gain access to and in what order. So, I mean, it depends on the nature of the event. You know, going back to it, do we get hit, with the Hayward quake, or do we get hit with something else? So that's the earthquake side of it, and then it's a matter of, well, if there's flooding, where's that going to be at? Or if there's a wildland interface fire, where's that going to be at? And again, it's gonna impact the response effort as far as what can be brought in what order. Yeah.
And
I'm wondering if, in your case, I mean, if you have known that would happen, where all the people that live in rural areas, if they know that that's gonna happen, should they not be advised to get some kind of a radio or something? Because they wouldn't even know if they were sitting there with no.
Exactly.
That's, no, I completely agree. And the interesting thing is that when you start dealing with people that live in more rural, areas, they usually are more self-sufficient. They are used to leaning on each other more than we are in an urban environment. And, I mean, it's funny. And, I mean, this is gonna take me to extremes. You drive along out in the middle of nowhere and you see a trailer, house sitting on the side, and it's got that huge propane tank next to it and an outhouse. Most people would turn around and look at that and go, wow, they're living way off the grid, it's just unbearable. I'm looking at it going, okay, they've got their sanitation under control, they have a heat source, for said trailer, and the thing actually has somewhat of a base isolator built into it because of the suspension system. So, it depends on how you look at things. And again, when you're dealing with a rural population base, they are more akin to leaning on each other and knowing each other. They may not get along, same as in an urban environment, but at least they're willing to share and understand that they're, at risk, and they're willing to lean in on each other. I mean, we get to really remote areas for California Caltrans and the training that goes on there. And it's interesting to note how they will turn around and start leaning off of the local resources, and the local resources will start leaning off of them. They're a state entity. They do it much more fluidly than you could ever run into here in District 4 or down in LA. And it's just because they know that they have to rely on each other because there's nobody else.
And one other tip that I've picked up in the course of this public safety power shutoff planning process is that the only radio that you can be pretty sure is going to work is the National Weather Radio. And while that's typically been used for weather alerts, there's discussion now of using that for all kinds of emergency alerts, because there will be no other way to warn people if the power goes off unexpectedly, or you were paying that much attention to what was going on and now suddenly you don't have power. So it's not a big investment to buy one of those National Weather Radios, and so it's one of the things that the CERT program and other community-oriented programs are now going to be promoting for self-preparedness, is at least if you have the National Weather Radio, you'll be able to get information about sheltering in place and things like that. Ray Reardon, the emergency manager for the city of San Jose, has come, so.
Well, in all the schools in the San Jose area, public schools have been delivered a National Weather Radio. They're put in the admin offices for that reason, for communications.
Oh, that's great. But that's something that really should be replicated. So clearly you guys know about that, but sort of to Kip's point about what do we do with this earthquake early warning system ability to shut things off, maybe it's also turn things on by having the National Weather Radio. Well, we've had a wonderful conversation, and I feel kind of bad in a way to stop it, but I also want you to have some time to talk to each other more informally and give us some feedback on what you thought about today's event. So our kind staff has delivered to each of you an evaluation form, and we'd be so appreciative if you take a minute or two to give us your feedback on today's event. We also have the boards up in the back that I mentioned, so I hope you've been writing your thoughts down on the colored Post-its, and you'll find there are 3 boards. One is for ideas about new public policies that we need, or government actions that are needed. Another one is about changes to the built environment of transportation, and a third is the built environment on buildings. So if you have ideas, please put it on the board that you think most closely resembles your area of thought. And we are going to be writing an article for a journal called Public Administration Review. And so your ideas will be incorporated into the material for the article. So really, we appreciate your input and your thoughts. So does anybody have any last thoughts? Well, thank you so much for spending your afternoon, and I would like you to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for presenting. And now now it's time for wine and cheese.
Oh, yes, and there's also fresh coffee. We saw that some of our guests would enjoy another cup, so help yourself.
Yeah, that, yeah. Almost 90. He sailed his boat. He was actually quite a charismatic guy. And he sailed his boat from Rookwood to San Francisco. Business, and he was big in the St. Francis Yacht Club. He was all made. Been like, I studied a lot.
Well, yeah.
Angel Priest and Mark and Paul, those guys were